All right, so 35 years after the end of the Cold War, it feels like we're stepping right back into a familiar yet totally new era of geopolitical tension. You've got the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and the rhetoric between Washington and Moscow is practically at a boiling point right now. From figures like Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky navigating some really complex diplomacy at the White House to Vladimir Putin issuing these stark warnings from the Kremlin, the political posturing is just relentless. But if we strip away all that politics and rhetoric, what are we actually left with? Well, let's find out in this explainer.
Because if a conventional war broke out today, who actually holds the advantage based on the numbers? That's the core question we're answering today. Now, we constantly hear headlines dominated by the threat of nuclear weapons. And look, for good reason. But history and military strategy tell us that actual battlefields, the kind that hold territory and define borders, those are decided by conventional military strength and sheer economic power. So today, we're bringing you the ultimate tale of the tape. Here's exactly how we're going to break this all down. First, the economic battlefield. Second, manpower and troops. Third, air and naval dominance. And finally, land warfare capabilities.
So, Section 1. The economic battlefield. Wars are won with money. And wow, the scale of the financial gap between these two nations is just staggering. In 2024, the United States maintained its position as the #1 economy in the world with a gross domestic product of $29 trillion. Russia, on the other hand, sitting at number 11 globally, had a GDP of just over $2 trillion. To put that in perspective, that $26.8 trillion difference means that even if Russia wanted to close the financial gap, it's virtually impossible to do so within this century. The absolute foundation of military power is economic power, and the U.S., they have an insurmountable lead here.
And you know that massive GDP translates directly into military spending. For 2025, the U.S. set its defense budget at $895 billion. Now, Russia actually increased its defense spending by 25% recently, bringing their total to roughly $145 billion. But even with that massive bump, the U.S. is still outspending Russia by $750 billion in a single year. And this isn't just about paying soldiers, right? This massive financial cushion allows the U.S. to continuously develop cutting-edge, totally unmatched advanced weaponry that smaller economies literally just cannot afford to research.
Moving on to Section 2. Manpower and troops, the human element.
Because at the end of the day, demographics dictate endurance. The U.S. starts with a massive advantage here. A population of nearly 342 million compared to Russia's 140 million. That's a 200 million person difference right off the bat. And when we look at the population actually fit for military service, the U.S. has nearly 125 million people, compared to Russia's 46 million. Plus, every single year, over 4.4 million Americans reach military age, compared to just 1.2 million in Russia. So, what does this all mean? Basically, the U.S. has a virtually endless pool of manpower to draw from to sustain a prolonged conflict.
Now, on the surface, the active standing armies are actually at parity. They've got roughly 1.3 million troops each. But if you look beneath the surface, a totally different story emerges. Russia holds a distinct and frankly massive advantage in reserve forces with 2 million troops compared to just under 80,000 for the U.S. Add to that Russia's 250,000 paramilitary forces, a category where the U.S. officially registers 0 since they rely entirely on regular army deployments. So when you're talking about immediate, secondary waves of soldiers, Russia has built up a really significant numerical buffer. All right, let's jump to Section 3, Air and Naval Dominance, ruling the skies and seas.
Up in the skies, this gap becomes a total chasm. The United States operates over 13,000 aircraft to Russia's roughly 4,300. So while Russia technically holds the title of the second largest air force in the world, the distance between number 1 and number 2 is nearly 9,000 aircraft. Objectively speaking, this overwhelming numerical superiority gives the U.S. Air Force undisputed dominance of the skies. It's not even close.
But beyond just your standard fighters, true dominance actually lies in logistics. The U.S. leads in attack aircraft and transports, for sure, but the real power multipliers here are trainers and aerial tankers. The U.S. has over 2,600 trainer aircraft compared to Russia's 611, which allows them to train elite pilots at a vastly higher volume. And then there are aerial tankers, 605 for the U.S. versus just 19 for Russia. 19! These planes refuel jets mid-flight, giving the U.S. unmatched global reach. It means they can strike practically anywhere on the planet without even needing a nearby runway. And the story continues with rotary aircraft. Helicopters are absolutely critical for close air support,
troop transport, and rapid medical evacuation in modern warfare. The U.S. fields 5,843 total helicopters to Russia's 1,651. But even more crucial are the heavily armed attack helicopters. The U.S. holds nearly a 2-to-1 advantage here, with over 1,000 specialized, lethal attack choppers compared to Russia's 557.
Now, shifting our focus out to the oceans, the numbers initially look a bit more balanced. The total naval fleet sees the U.S. at 440 vessels and Russia pretty close behind at 419. Even in the highly strategic submarine category, the U.S. has 70 to Russia's 63. But here's a secret any seasoned naval strategist will tell you. Just counting the total number of hulls in the water, it doesn't tell the whole story. The actual quality, the tonnage, and the type of power projection matter way more than sheer volume.
And that qualitative gap is undeniable. The United States operates 11 massive aircraft carriers and 9 helicopter carriers. Russia operates exactly 1 older aircraft carrier and 0 helicopter carriers. Look, aircraft carriers are basically floating sovereign territories, mobile cities that allow a nation to project overwhelming air power to literally any coastline on Earth. The U.S. has an entire fleet of them. Russia essentially has none.
Which brings us to Section 4, Land Warfare Capabilities, the Ground Game. Down on the ground, this is where Russia heavily prioritizes traditional mechanized warfare. They actually hold a lead of over 1,100 main battle tanks, fielding 5,750 compared to the U.S.'s 4,640. However, when we zoom out to look at all armored vehicles, which includes the infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers that are so crucial for troop survival, the U.S. has an overwhelming superiority. We're talking over 391,000 vehicles against Russia's 131,000. Now, Russia's entire military doctrine is built around punishing overwhelming artillery barrages. They field over 5,100 mobile artillery units to the U.S.'s 671, and over 8,500 towed pieces compared to roughly 1,200 for the U.S. In mobile rocket projectors, Russia holds a commanding 3,005 to the U.S.'s 641. In a grinding, static war of attrition, this sheer volume of artillery is a truly devastating force. But when we synthesize all this data, zooming out from just the artillery tubes to look at the entire battlefield ecosystem, the verdict becomes incredibly clear. The United States possesses undisputed total dominance in economy, total manpower, aerial control, and naval power projection. Statistically speaking, based strictly on the numbers we've just unpacked together, an outright conventional victory for Russia against the United States is virtually impossible. And we don't even have to look at theoretical models to prove this, right? We have live evidence in the ongoing Ukraine conflict. Despite having a massive air force on paper, Russia severely limits its use of combat aircraft in Ukrainian airspace. Why? Well, because they are highly vulnerable to the US and European anti-air technology supplied to Ukraine. Instead, Russia is forced to rely heavily on long-range missiles and standoff weapons, completely avoiding direct aerial confrontation with Western tech. Which brings us to a pretty sobering conclusion. When you understand the sheer mathematical reality of this conventional military gap, the geopolitical rhetoric really starts to make sense. As this quote notes, conventional weakness necessitates nuclear posturing. President Putin's frequent references to Russia's nuclear arsenal are a direct consequence of knowing that a conventional, boots-on-the-ground, jets-in-the-sky war against the U.S. simply cannot be won. The nuclear threat is kind of the ultimate equalizer for a conventional deficit. So, will this massive conventional gap prevent a direct conflict or trigger an unconventional one? It's arguably the most vital geopolitical question of our time. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the numbers behind the headlines.